Well, this was, as you've heard me say all week, a bad week for middle-class Minnesotans in the Minnesota legislature, but a good week for rich corporations. The tax bill that they passed, basically a reverse Robin Hood, taking from seniors and the disabled and over 300,000 Minnesotans who earn under $55,000 a year to give tax cuts to corporations and businesses. It's not the right priorities for Minnesota, not the direction that we ought to be headed in this state, and maybe more than any other bill that we've seen this legislative session, this is the bill that clearly defines the differences between the parties, both in terms of their values and their economic vision for the state of Minnesota going forward. It's clearly the Republicans' idea to continue to pursue this failed policy that has failed us for the last decade in this country, that just getting out of the way of corporations is the way that we're going to build a strong economy. It hasn't worked. It's never worked, and it won't work. The way that you build a strong economy historically is to actually build a strong middle class. That's how this country became the greatest economic engine in the world over the last century. And it's the way that we're going to do it again in this century and in this state. It's the reason that over the last 40 years, Minnesota has succeeded as one of the most prosperous states in the country, and we need to continue that as well. And so we are going to continue to be committed and continue to talk about the fact that we need to build a strong middle class in this country and in this state, and it's about not just giving all the property tax breaks to corporations, but also starting to work on reducing property taxes for residential Minnesota homeowners, and making sure that we're investing in our education system instead of tinkering around the edges. We actually reduce class sizes. That's how you actually make sure that effective teachers can interact with students in the most effective way. We've been so focused on these distracting reforms that we haven't gotten after what we really need to do. We are so much caught up in this rhetoric that the Republicans push forward that all we can do is cut. All we can do is do it just like businesses do. All that we can do is live in a time of scarcity when, in fact, we have all kinds of resources in this state that we should be drawing on and that we are ignoring just because, I think Tom Rukavina made the point during the tax debate exceedingly well. We have, 59 Minnesotans in this state who control $2.7 billion. This is not a situation where we don't lack resources. This is a situation where we're not willing to allocate those resources appropriately to make sure that that everybody in the state can succeed, and that is a real disappointment. The other thing that has become very clear this week is that the Republicans remain obsessed with passing constitutional amendments. We had the long debate on the floor on Tuesday going into Wednesday morning. The next day, the Senate takes up the bill in the Rules Committee. They're going to be hearing the voter ID on the floor, as I understand it, today. Last night, you saw on the House floor the Republican caucus basically imploding over the issues of constitutional amendments. I understand Speaker Zellers, again today, just a few minutes ago, refused to take the right to work amendment off the table. It's very much within his power and prerogative to do that right now, and he should do that. And if he doesn't do that, the rhetoric that he is using, that they're actually focused on jobs instead of constitutional amendments, rings very hollow. The Republicans should be focusing on what really matters to Minnesotans, which is getting people back to work, making sure we're reducing property taxes, and if they don't have any interest in doing that and getting some legitimate bills signed, we really ought to just go home and not waste the taxpayers' dollars anymore sitting around here. So that's what I have. If there's any questions.
Mr. Minority Leader, I've had contact with election judges as well as county auditors in regards to photo ID, and there's a concern there that there will be an attrition rate that will be far higher if photo ID were to be implemented, because the stopgap, the person is the election judge that's going to be the arbiter of that decision. Does that issue concern you, and should it concern the rest of Minnesota?
Well, certainly. I think the fact that one of the big concerns we have with the photo ID is that it's going to keep eligible legal voters from voting, and that would be a true disservice to a state that's prided itself on making sure that we have great voter participation. Beyond that, I think the most interesting part of the discussion on the voter ID, at least to me, is the fact that although the Republicans claim it's incredibly important that someone show an ID when they show up to the polls, for for nearly close to half the voters now, and it's getting closer to that. I don't know the exact statistic, but that are voting by absentee ballot or voting by mail, they don't seem to care if they can actually have a facial identification, right? So there's really two classes of voters out there right now. There's folks that show up at the polls, they have to show their ID, but if you're going to vote absentee, there's no pictorial, there's no photo identification required whatsoever. And what that tells me is that this is really not about people showing up and having a recognition, identification before they vote. What it's about, and I really think this is true, is an attack on same-day registration in this state. I think Secretary Ritchie is absolutely correct about that. Secretary of State when she was Secretary of State, Representative Kiffmeyer, one of her top priorities was getting rid of same-day registration. And the only reason I can think that you would require an ID if you go to the polls, but you're not going to require an ID for voting in any other way, is to get at the folks that are trying to register on the day of election at the polls. And again, that's a huge disservice to the people of Minnesota, and I hope that I think that is actually a story that's yet to be told around this whole photo ID issue, and it should be told.
As a follow, though, if you lose election judges by attrition at higher rates, isn't that a concern as well if you have nobody to proctor the election?
Yes, I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question. Yes, I think that is true.
Mr. Leader, what's the motive, what's the political motive of Republicans for trying to choke off same-day registration?
Well, I don't know what the political motive, I can't understand it. I don't know why anybody would want to stop same-day registration. I think more and more voter participation makes a lot of sense. So you'd have to ask Representative Kiffmeyer that.
Are they afraid that more Democrats, more of your constituents kind of make up their minds at the last minute and, show up at the polls?
I don't know what you'd have to ask them what they're thinking about.
I'm just wondering about your theory.
Yes.
Okay.
There is one bill where you will have a lot of leverage, and that's the bonding bill. Have you had discussions on it? The support in the committee was very tepid for that bill.
I think the support was tepid for from both sides of the aisle on that bill. Yeah, certainly that is something that we're going to be looking closely at. I think there was a single Democratic vote that actually passed the bill, and there's not a lot of strong support in our caucus for that bill as it currently stands. As we said earlier as I said earlier this week, it's small. It's too small, particularly considering the interest rates and the cost of construction and all those things, and more importantly, the great need we have out there to invest in our infrastructure. I think most Minnesotans get that that's something that makes sense. And so, and maybe the biggest frustration is that Representative Howes, and maybe it's not Representative Howes, maybe it's being driven by his leadership, but really has reached out very little, if at all, to our members to kind of put together a bill that could garner bipartisan support. I mean, the bonding bill is the one place, if any place, that we should be putting together a bipartisan bill, and so far that has been not in evidence at all.
Are Democrats in a box at all where if you don't put up the votes for it, there's a risk that a bonding bill just doesn't happen this year?
Well, I think that, again, is up to the Republicans. They're the ones that are in charge. I think they have a number of members that would actually like a bonding bill to go forward, and we're just not going to be in a position of supporting something that is too poor, too weak. That doesn't make any sense from our perspective. If we're going to do it, we ought to put together a decent bonding bill. And I think that more important than kind of the Democrat-Republican thing, it's what the people of Minnesota want. That's what they want us to do. And, I would remind, whenever we talk about the bonding bill, I can always hear in the back of my mind, the Republicans saying, oh, but we can't spend this, we can't borrow money anymore, we borrowed too much. But for a party that borrowed $700 million for one-time spending, again, that doesn't ring very true with me.
Well, Mr. Leader, if the Republicans bring forward a $500 million bonding bill, say, which is like $250 million less, roughly, than what the governor has proposed, are you saying that you folks won't put up the necessary votes to pass that bill just because it's too small?
No, we need to look at the bill, obviously, and if it's $500 million, that's much different than $280 million, and a $500 million bill that actually includes some projects that are spread across the state instead of just in Republican districts is a very different bill. So there's a lot of pieces to this that I think are worthwhile, especially if that $500 million bill also includes the other bill that they passed, which is the $240 million for the Capitol. Then we're kind of talking more in the ballpark and in the range.
Can you see a scenario where Governor Dayton would not sign whatever bonding bill is sent to him ultimately?
I haven't talked to him about it, so I don't know. I haven't thought about that.
Isn't this legislative session, which is a bonding session. If you don't get a bonding bill out of here, isn't that a failure of leadership?
Well, I think Minnesotans expect us to get a bonding bill done this year, and it makes good economic sense for us to do it. And I'll leave it for the voters to decide, whether the session has been successful or not.
So what would happen if we had a year without a bonding bill?
Well, we had one in 2005.
Your members of your caucus actually helped facilitate the bonding bill coming out of committee. Why would they do that?
One of our members did, yeah. I haven't talked to her. Okay, thank you.